looked at my ancestry, and there was this one part of the side of my family that was Armenian, and I didn't know anything about it. And it was my mother, actually, who was the first person that told me about this thing called the Armenian genocide. And from there, I was just always very interested about this place called Armenia. And so when I first started university, I started meeting other students that were my age that were Armenian. And once they found out that I had a little bit of Armenian in me, they were like, oh, why don't you come to some events? And so I became more involved in the community, and as I became more involved in the community, Armenia all of a sudden became this magical place far away that I really wanted to see one day, and so that's what I ended up doing and went to go pursue.
So in some ways, the history or the legacy of the genocide is one thing that would have sort of drawn you in to this, and that's telling too, because very often a country's or a people's fate, a tragic fate in this case, is something that would draw later generations in and creates a fate community of sorts. So what impact did the history of the genocide have on you?
Well, it's funny because with my family, they know very little about it, and every time that you ask them, you're always going to get different stories and that. But essentially, my great-grandfather was he owned horses. From what we know, he was a priest, and when the genocide happened, he left just before the genocide, because of course the Armenian genocide was not something like the Holocaust where it just happened full force. There was like massacres that slowly led up to it by 1915, and so around 1910, the Turks had been drafted. I believe it was 1910 or 1912, not entirely sure. But they started drafting Armenians into the army, and of course this was an excuse to put them into slave labor battalions and to kill them and that. So he had made a deal with the British ambassador or the British consulate, and he was able to bribe him with gold, and that's how he got him out of the country. And the rest of his brothers and sisters, we don't know about, were killed. So yeah, that was something that was very interesting to me. But I think going beyond that, it wasn't necessarily just the genocide that sort of fascinated me about it. Armenia is a very rich culture that has a lot more than just the genocide, and so it wasn't so much the genocide, but it was the life and the uniqueness of this country. Whether it was its cuisine, its unique music, its art, its literature, its unique form of Christianity, its architecture. That's what really drew me in. So of course I think that the genocide is something that sort of woke up my attention, but reading more about this culture, well, who are these people, and what happened, why was there this genocide and that, and reading about it, that's what really fascinated me to finally have the motivation to go over there and that.
So this begs the question, I wasn't going to ask this initially, but I'll ask it now.
Yes.
Do you care for the idea of hyphenated identities at all? Are you an Armenian Canadian, or are you just a Canadian, or just an Armenian?
No, I think I would agree in hyphenated identities. Yeah, okay. I am an Armenian Canadian, definitely.
Okay. Definitely. Now, you ended up going to Armenia for the first time, though, I gather, not too long ago, as part of an internship, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And I guess what makes me curious is, it is, as you mentioned, a country in a very different region, obviously different language, different culture. But what were your first thoughts when that plane landed in Yerevan and you saw the city for the first time, the capital for the first time?
Well, I've only been to Canada and the United States. So, just being across the Atlantic, for instance, was very fascinating. I was looking over the plane the entire time thinking, well, is this where Napoleon fought this guy? Or is this where this, special historical circumstance happened at? And finally landing, I remember we landed in the evening, and the airport, when you get off the plane, when you get past the first terminal and that, there's a sign that says, "Welcome home, welcome to Armenia." So I thought that was really interesting. But right when I came off the terminal, there were these the people handling the security at the airport. They're all dressed in this Sovietized uniform, and so that right away sort of just woke me up of, wow, I'm not in Kansas anymore. And it was really interesting, just right away, their tone and how they handle you and that. I mean, in Canada, you take it for granted that people are very cordial and polite, but over there, it's this very stern, what are you doing here and that. And when I finally came out of the airport, I remember I got into I knew I was going to get screwed because I had never dealt with this currency before. I had never dealt with the money or anything before, and so they saw me, they knew I was a Westerner, they wanted, oh, will you get in this taxi, will you get in that taxi? The group I was with was actually supposed to pick me up, and they completely forgot, and it was around, I think, 11 in the evening, and I kept pacing back and forth thinking, well, they'll come here eventually. They never did. Finally, I just said, all right, I'm negotiating with one of them, and I knew right away that they wanted to get more money out of me than what was expected with these taxi drivers, but so I finally brought it down to a number that I thought was okay, and I got into the cab, and it wasn't even a cab, it was just a normal beat-up Russian car that just had a taxi sign on it, and I didn't know what I was doing, I didn't know, it was quite a risk, and I just remember I got in, and we're driving down the road, and I had spoke a little bit of Russian, because I studied a little bit of it, but it was really bad. But still, I started conversing with him, and this man starts telling me his life, like he starts making a gun hand gesture, telling that he was fighting in the war and all that, and you're speeding down the road, and there's all these bricks and these buildings that are like not in the best condition when you're in the suburbs of Yerevan, and you see there's this sign of Armenia trying to join the EU, and it was really a huge culture shock. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Now, once you actually sort of settled in and started your internship, you worked with the Armenian Young Lawyers Association, I gather. And I think part of their work focuses on corruption-related issues. So based on your experience, what you heard, what you learned, and what you saw, how comparable or how different is corruption in Armenia than, for example, in Canada or any other Western liberal democracy? Is it similar? Is it drastically different?
No, it's radically different, and it is a product of living under the tyranny of communism. Because during communism, a lot of products you couldn't just go to the market and buy. You'd have to know somebody. You'd have to either have a friend or a cousin who would know somebody. Simply if you wanted to put a sofa into your house, if you wanted to get an apartment, if you wanted to get a car, you had to know this underground market of doing favors for one another. And so when free market capitalism sort of just threw itself upon these former Soviet countries in the 90s, that culture of doing people favors still stayed intact. And so what the Armenian Young Lawyers Association tries to do is usher in it understands that democracy is not going to be something that's just going to come up overnight. It realizes that if an actual robust democracy is to exist, it is to create a sort of civil functioning legal society in the normal day-to-day life, and that's what it tries to do. It's not idealist by any means. It's quite pragmatic of going forth and creating initiatives, whether it be monitoring certain ministries and where public money is being spent. Whether it's helping the old lady keep her house when the government's trying to tear it down because they want to put up a condominium. So it's going about those routes of creating legal precedents and just creating a normal day-to-day lifestyle of there being a society that abides by the rule of law.
How does the average Armenian sort of handle the fact that this is obviously a work in progress and that corruption is an everyday reality? Or people are obviously aware of it? Or
people are certainly aware of it, and the civil society is becoming more conscious of it, and they have a very different idea about democracy than, say, the West. They don't. For instance, when I was there, they were going through an election, a presidential election, and there was one candidate who was an Armenian who was born and raised in the United States. Quite progressive. He was the foreign minister during the 90s when the country was at war. Quite a progressive leader and Western thinking and that fold. And then there was the sort of not KGB, but the sort of Soviet bureaucrat who still was for maintaining the status quo of corruption. But when the election happened, there wasn't this outpouring of supporting the clearly the better candidate. They still voted for the corrupt, sort of Sovietized person that was for the oligarchs, that was for the culture of corruption. So the culture itself it's very pessimistic when it comes to democracy. However, what was interesting was during this year there was a protest revolving around raising the fees on taxis, raising the fees on water. And that drew out lots of people out into the streets and to protest the government for a long time. So it's interesting that when it comes down to certain certain subsects, whether it be electing a president or ridding the entire culture of corruption. That's not so much something that they're going out into the streets for. But when it comes to something pragmatic that's affecting their day-to-day life, whether it be their taxi fare or whether how much it takes for public transportation, or whether it's increasing their electricity bill or water bills, that's something that of which they do take to the streets en masse and protest.
So basically, and this is not surprising for Eastern Europe or other regions too, bread and butter issues count. And at the end of the day, concerns about democratic discourse, concerns about lofty, liberal or democratic ideals often are trumped by the everyday realities, and taxi fares being one of them, for example. What was your organization able to actually contribute to the democratic discourse in the country? Are they able to actually steer it in a different way, in a more maybe thoughtful manner?
Well, there are a lot of NGOs on the ground that are working in part and are funded by, for instance, organizations like USAID that are heavily trying to contribute to the culture of anti-corruption. And like I said, monitoring government spending on certain public works projects like road repairs or fixing up certain falling apart buildings and that. There is that there. As to whether or not it's making huge effects, no, it's slow, it's gradual, and it's not trying to be idealistic by any means. It's trying to be an outlet that is there, that is setting precedents. It also works a lot in training young lawyers who are fresh out of school and sending them out to different regions in Armenia outside of Yerevan to contribute to the anti-corruption movement outside of Yerevan. So in cities that are no bigger than 25,000, where corruption is a lot more rampant than, let's say, the urban center. So there's that taking place where they're trying to set up a new sort of generation of lawyers that are able to tackle that. So, like I said, there is not this huge movement where you can point at something in particular and say, look, this is changing. But they are sort of shuffling the cards to maintain that there will be a slow but gradual process of ushering in an anti-corruption culture.
And all this begs the question as well, how independent is the judiciary currently from the political powers at be in Armenia? That's a problem that exists in other Eastern European countries. Is it actually independent?
From my experience, I would say no. There's a lot of cases where things are just thrown out of court, a lot of accusations that are just dismissed. Whether it be with election fraud, when it's actually brought to be charged, always something fishy is happening. So there are attempts for it to become more independent, but when it comes down to big significant issues, there is a higher hand of this sort of underground state that maintains that the status quo stays.
Now, one case that, of course, made international headlines, and that had to do more with a court case and a criminal case in Hungary, is that of Remil Safarov. Who essentially ended up murdering an Armenian officer in Hungary, and he was imprisoned by the Hungarian courts, but then he was freed and ultimately extradited to Azerbaijan, where he was basically greeted as a hero. Yeah. That made ripples around the world. I know there was an Armenian protest in front of the Hungarian embassy here in Ottawa. How did Armenian society react to this based upon your experience?
Well, I think on the one hand, it wasn't a surprise to Armenians to see Azerbaijan do this. This is a country that continually breaks the ceasefire. This is a country whose president says that the enemies of Azerbaijan is all Armenians in the world. This is a country that suffered a genocide from the Turks for being Armenian. And these are the same. These are the same people that they're dealing with. So they're not necessarily surprised that someone as egregious and horrible as Remil Safarov would have been greeted in Azerbaijan as a hero. I don't think that necessarily came to a shock to them. But what did come to a shock to them is that a Western country like Hungary would have been sort of complacent with allowing such a horrible figure to be transferred to this oil Caspian dictatorship, Azerbaijan, and being, I guess, sort of, I think the political entities in Hungary that were naive enough to actually believe in President Aliyev's word that he was still going to serve his sentence. in Azerbaijan. So I think that the outrage was more at Hungary. Armenia suspended all its diplomatic relations with Hungary after. It wasn't a surprise that Azerbaijan did something like this, but it was a surprise that a Western country like Hungary was a party to what happened.
And you mentioned Aliyev, for example, and I'm quite certain that his public image in a place like Armenia is I'm sure, quite dark. And it's dark in many circles in Hungary as well. But the reality is that the Hungarian government had all kinds of business dealings with the leadership in Armenia, in Azerbaijan. So there's all kinds of sort of underground connections that exist here, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I don't like the point that I wouldn't necessarily agree that the image of Aliyev is dark in Armenia. He's quite humorous. They sort of poke fun at him constantly. There's numerous sort of cartoons that are not created by the state. It's grassroots, where they're showing always poking fun at this leader that he looks like a donkey, or they sort of find his tweets about how they're going to liberate former Azerbaijani lands, and that they look at that with much humor. He's not necessarily this character that they fear. He's certainly this sort of post-Soviet strongman leader in the country next door that does a lot of stupid things, and I think the majority of Armenians know that he's not there because of his actual wit or character, but because of oil money.
So talking about post-Soviet strongmen, obviously you can't avoid talking about Vladimir Putin and Russia, and the way that Russia is trying to reinvent itself in the world, and reinvent itself in the region, but also, of course, further afield in the Middle East more recently. What kind of feelings did you hear or sense surrounding Russia and the fact that Putin in particular is viewed as quite an expansionist in terms of Russia's economic and political might in the region? And there's very much a feeling in parts of Eastern Europe that he's attempting to recreate some elements of former Soviet glory and influence. Is that a fear at all in Armenia?
Well, I don't think I think many... It depends. I think it ultimately depends on who you talk to in Armenia. If you're talking to average day people who grew up under the Soviet Union, and that they sympathize a lot with Vladimir Putin in the sense that the humiliation suffered after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and how there is this character that is resurrecting Russia from these ails of the post-Soviet era from Yeltsin and that, where he's bringing Russia to a place that it's a country that sort of regained its dignity. And many people in Armenia who grew up under the Soviet Union have this nostalgia for the stability and quality of life that was ushered in during the sort of later phase of the communist era, and how that went awash when the Berlin Wall came down, with these oligarchs seizing all the wealth. So there is a nostalgia and an empathy with a character like Putin of bringing Russia back to its sort of former days of glory. But on the other hand, I think I'll stay on this point. You have to understand at the same time that of the sort of geostrategic crisis that Armenia is in, it doesn't have many friendly neighbors. To its south is Iran, to the south is Turkey, who has a close border, and on the other side is a country that wants to wipe out its mere existence and won't even sign a peace treaty since 1994. It looks to Russia as a partner that is able to address these fears that it has with its neighbors. Russia houses a large military base in its second largest city, Gyumri. Armenia is a member of the CSTO. So the upper echelons in the country are very pro-Russian, but there also is a large segment of the society that is very pro-Russia, that does like the regime of Vladimir Putin. However, there also is a new emerging sect in the society of very educated, Western-leaning Armenians who don't necessarily trust Vladimir Putin and are not very admirable of his motives or how he's been moving Russia. And on the same hand, those people are very skeptical at the fact that yes, Russia is a strategic partner for Armenia in the CSTO, but at the same time supplies lots of arms to the Azerbaijanis annually, and does not necessarily take a formal stance on condemning Azerbaijan when it continually breaks its ceasefire. So there is a critique of the Putin regime, but it is something that is new and is merging mostly among I would say the younger demographics who don't necessarily have this sort of nostalgia for the Soviet days.
Now, you raise an interesting point here because the symbols of the Soviet days are quite prominent and quite popular in some demographics in some of the former Soviet states. I traveled myself to, for example, Transnistria, which isn't a state as such or not recognized, but also there's a documentary on Transnistria in which one of the characters says something that's very, very key, and she says that we don't make war with our monuments and with our statues. In other words, we preserve the symbols and statues of the former Soviet days. Does that happen at all in Armenia?
I would say that's an interesting question because unlike other former Soviet republics, Armenia has a very, very strong culture that existed even before the Soviet days. It is a culture that existed under the Persian Empire, under the Ottoman Empire, and it still retained its culture, its unique language, its unique religion, and that doesn't change at all even under its living under the Soviet Union. So even during the Soviet days, it still had a lot of admiration for its own poets, its own writers, its own political leaders, its national heroes. So it wasn't very hard for Armenia to sort of fill in this void of the hammer and sickle with something else, because that something else had always remained even during the Soviet days. They have removed they had giant statues of Lenin and murals and that, and much of those have been taken down. But if you go, for instance, in Republic Square at the National Defense building, they still have the hammer and sickle and the coat of arms. It's not necessarily something that I would say is looked at with a lot of animosity. Once again, there is a lot of nostalgia for the quality of living that they enjoyed under the Soviet Union, but the actual symbols and statuses of Lenin or anything of that regime is not necessarily admired, but it's something that I would say is something that they're quite passive about. It's not something that really angers under their blood.
Okay. And you alluded to this before, but when I think of key challenges facing Armenia, obviously one of them is what you mentioned, that it doesn't have terribly friendly neighbors in every case. What's the current status with Turkey? Turkey's an important regional player. Turkey's also, a close enough ally of key Western powers like the U.S. What is the relationship today, if any, between Armenia and Turkey? And is it improving at all?
Well, I would say that if I could compare it, Canadians are always watching about what's going on in the United States. And many of the intellectual elites and many of the academics are constantly watching what is going on in Turkey. There are many Turkish language classes. They're watching its political realm. They're watching the Erdogan government. They're very caught up on what's going on in Turkey. So it's not simply this animosity about the genocide. They're very well acquainted with what's going on in Turkey. Many Armenians travel to Istanbul every year, but it's still a wound that hasn't healed. When you're there on April 24th, which is the day of the commemoration of the genocide, the night before, crowds come out to go march up to the genocide monuments. This is now Convert. And before they begin that process, the marching up there, they do burn the Turkish flag. There is a lot of animosity towards the Turkish state. I had the privilege of visiting the border where we went past one of the military checkpoints, and we were able to actually stand on the cliff right on the Turkish border, and you can see Armenian churches just on the other side. This is something real to them. When you're in the country, Mount Ararat dominates the skyline of everywhere you go, and it hurts them to know that this is in another country, that it's not theirs, and this is a country that did genocide their ancestors and has not reconciled it at all by any means or even acknowledged it. So they're very well acquainted with Turkey, of what's going on, but it is a wound that still exists. It's something that plays a huge part in their culture. It's not something that I think is going to change anytime soon. Funny story was when I was in Gyumri, which is the second largest city, it too has a large monument that dominates the skyline that is Mother Armenia. And when we had walked up to see this mural. Gumri is right on the border with Turkey. And when we walked up to this monument of this woman that's holding a pistol looking over the city of Gumri, when you go to the other side of the statue, it's actually this demon alligator that is staring off at the Turkish village not too far off. So when Turks look to Armenia, they see this statue of this angry dragon that is staring at them. So it's something that it's constant there. It's a wound that won't change by any means, or anytime soon, I don't think. But it's not something that I don't believe by any means that Armenians are irrational about. They're very engaged with what's going on in Turkey. They know a lot about Turkey, its political ongoings, the sort of the sort of growing dictatorship of Erdogan. They're very well acquainted with what Turkey's doing.
So today, if you look at Armenia, what would you say the key challenges are, whether they're political or economic or social? What would be the areas that the country is really struggling with?
I would say without a doubt it's corruption. I think that the wind is at its back, because now that the Soviet Union has ended, there is a large influx of diasporan Armenians who have lived in Syria, who have lived in the United States, that are coming back to Armenia, making significant investments, starting new businesses. These are people that have a completely different mindset than those who grew up under the Soviet Union. They know how to run businesses. They know how to thrive in a capitalistic system. And they know how to sort of overcome, whether it was the Armenians living in Syria, they know how to overcome the realities of living with a corrupt government and still succeed. These are the new entrepreneurs of Armenia, and they are making substantial changes. However, I still think that corruption is the number one problem in Armenia that is stagnating its growth and potential. Yes, there is an unfinished war to its side. Yes, it's next to a country that doesn't recognize the atrocities that it committed in the last century. But I think that the number one problem in terms of Armenia is to become successful, if it's to fortify itself as a regional player that is significant, it matters. It has to overcome its own sort of troubles inside itself, which is this status quo that is maintaining just a disgusting amount of corruption.
And do you see yourself ever going back and playing some kind of role in Armenia?
If I could, it's if there's a way in which I could be able to sustain myself and live over there financially, I think is the question. But yeah, certainly I would like in many ways to have the opportunity at least to live back over there, to thrive in that culture. It's a wonderful, beautiful culture. The people are just they're just wonderful in every way. They're both beautiful. They're both challenging. They really bring the soul out of you in many ways, and it's a wonderful place that I miss every day.